The State of Perfect Balance looks at solved and unsolved murders from the smallest towns across Ohio. We appreciate every one of our subscribers and read your feedback faithfully. If you feel that what we do is worth a couple of dollars each month, please consider becoming a supporter of ours. You can find out more on Podbean, The State of Perfect Balance. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy this week's episode.
This podcast deals with true events of a violent and disturbing nature, intended for a mature audience. Listener discretion is strongly advised.
He liked to be with people. He was very friendly. I couldn't grieve for Troy until after the murder was solved. I don't see him much, but I think of him always. Every time I think of Troy, I think of John, because John brought everything to a head and we could, start living again.
Hey guys, I'm your host Amanda, and this is The State of Perfect Balance. Let's use a metaphor here, one that may help you understand the nature of the relationship between the couple I'm going to talk about in a moment and how their lives became intertwined in a small Cincinnati suburb in 1995. So when I'm not working at my day job or working on the podcast, I absolutely love to bake and cook. Seriously, I love it. Audition for Master Chef kind of love it. Anyway, and not to oversell myself, I make this insanely sinful, gooey, comforting, delicious, manna from the heavens salted caramel sauce. It, of course, requires me to melt sugar. Now, if you've ever made any kind of food that required you to melt sugar, you know how dangerous this can be if you aren't careful. If you get melted sugar on your skin, speaking from my own experience, I can tell you it's excruciating. And the pain is long-lasting because the sugar doesn't just burn you. No, it adheres tightly to your skin and becomes a molten blob searing through the layers of epidermis and into the flesh below. You're welcome for that imagery, by the way. And it's hard to rinse off because it's so firmly stuck to you. All you can think about is getting that sugar lava off you, and this is no easy task, believe me. You could say, metaphorically, that Troy Temar found himself immersed in a vat of burning sugar. He couldn't get that lava off him no matter how hard he tried, and the damage was extensive. And this is his story. You would think that a town named Deer Park would have been formed rather recently. It has the ring of a carefully laid out, planned community. But Deer Park, Ohio has roots going back into the period following the Revolutionary War, when a family built the first cabin there. 100 years later, the town, which is one of several such small communities just north of Cincinnati, boasted one store and a single Catholic church. Today, Deer Park is home to about 5,700 people. Troy Lee Temar was a big fish in the little pond that is Deer Park. Not because he was wealthy or from a successful family or anything like that, but because of real accomplishments of his own, and by being a generally well-liked, all-American guy. He was captain of the Deer Park High School football team, competed successfully for the track team, and was chosen homecoming king in 1987. After high school graduation in 1989, he worked with a contracting firm until he reached a point, rather rapidly, at which he could go out and start a firm of his own. Everybody seemed to like the tall and handsome Troy Temar, and when he wasn't working, he was squiring local women on dates, playing a little softball with his friends, helping raise money for local charities, and having fun on the weekends. He seemed to have it all, living a good life with a bright future ahead as he approached age 30. Maybe you've known someone like that. Someone who seemed destined to meet just the right mate, have some beautiful children, and the cars, and the white picket fence, and all of it, and you'd be glad for them. or you'd hate them. Either way. At the construction firm where Troy worked, he met a woman named Teresa Voss, who kept the books for the company. She was attractive and vivacious, and they began to see a lot of each other in their off hours. Teresa was fun, spirited, and intelligent. She was exactly Troy's type. And things between the two became serious enough that Teresa moved into Troy's house when he founded his own company, Team R Construction. And there, she continued to work with Troy, keeping the books for his new venture. But Teresa wasn't at all what she seemed, and things began to quickly unravel as her darker side emerged into the light of day. I'm sure you've all seen Fatal Attraction, and if not, you probably know all about it. And let me just say this. Silently weeping to Madame Butterfly and cooking rabbits have nothing on Miss Teresa Voss. In 1999, Troy planned to attend his class reunion without Teresa. If she couldn't go, then Teresa didn't want Troy to go either. So, she doused a cloth with some kind of extreme irritant and waited for him to fall asleep. The next morning, Troy went to the emergency room. He couldn't explain to ER doctors how he might have gotten such a severe topical red rash on his face, until he remembered vaguely awakening the night before to find Teresa dabbing his face with something wet. Prior to that, in February, Troy woke up and there was Teresa, standing over him with a pair of scissors, not moving, not talking, staring. He told his friends he was terrified of her but couldn't get her out of his house. He said, "She's got a thing for holidays. If she hurts me, it will definitely be on a holiday." A month later, Troy arrived home from work to find police waiting for him. They were there to arrest the stunned young man on the charge of domestic violence, and arrest him they did, as a bloody and bruised Teresa helplessly looked on. But Teresa was far from helpless. In fact, she had stabbed herself with a knitting needle and punched herself in the head and face just prior to calling police, claiming Troy had beaten her up. Eventually, she gave up on her story and admitted she had invented the whole thing, but not before Troy spent the night in jail. This incident, combined with the fact Troy discovered Teresa had been embezzling funds from the company they both worked for prior, finally led Troy to ask her to leave for good on March 19th, 1999. But Teresa Voss was not to be ignored. She had arrived in Troy's otherwise tidy and clean-cut life with a trail of violence and unstable behavior following closely behind her. On July 3rd, Troy worked on a house, stopped at his favorite golf course to set up a tea time, bought some sweet corn, and decided to stay home for a quiet evening. But later that night, Teresa called him. She wanted him to meet her. She wanted to apologize, she said, and put things behind them. And Troy, being the kind-hearted, gentle man he was, agreed to meet her. He was never seen alive again. Responding to a 911 call about a car on fire the next morning, firefighters discovered a Ford Mustang ablaze near an abandoned farmhouse at the crossroads of Turtle Creek Road and State Route 48. Once the fire was extinguished, they discovered the badly burned body of a man in the trunk. It was clear that the car and body had been soaked with gasoline, and a trail of more fuel through the grass formed a fuse line to the car. So what was used to start the blaze on this July 3rd evening? Fireworks. Yep. Someone lit the car on fire with fireworks, which is either completely insane or terrifyingly brilliant. It soon became clear, to everyone's horror, the burned body in the trunk was that of Troy Lee Temar, age 30. The Mustang was Troy's brother's car, which he'd borrowed to meet with Teresa Voss that night. There were no witnesses to the burning, but there were 2 women who'd said they'd stopped nearby earlier the night before to change drivers. In the night, they heard someone shouting, "Help me! Somebody help me, please! Help me!" The 2 were freaked out by it and drove off. The autopsy revealed several things. Troy had been shot through the upper left back and the chest, both wounds being inflicted at a very steep angle from above. Neither of the rounds caused immediate death. Troy died from bleeding out. Troy Temar was a strapping 190 pounds in life, but the burned remains weighed just 96 pounds. The first person to come into focus as a clear suspect won't surprise anyone. When police asked Troy's mother, Donna Temar, who might have harmed her son, she blurted out, "Teresa Voss." Voss had a story, though. She met with Troy, yes, but she left him in fine shape after they had a nice talk at French Park in Aberley, and then at Lincoln Airport. She dropped him off at his place, she said, and then went home herself. Her story, such as it was, seemed to check out, and there was nothing to tie her to the crime. Any forensic evidence had been consumed in the flames. There were no fingerprints or shoe tracks, and there was no pistol. And without Teresa, there were no other suspects, and eventually the case went cold. We often run across murder cases which grow cold, in part because the victim had few advocates to speak up and keep the process going. But here was a well-loved young man, well known in his hometown, with plenty of people in his life who cared about him, or at least knew him, including the officials who were charged with solving the case. No one wanted this murder to go unsolved, and yet it did, for 6 more years. Troy's family was emotionally destroyed. His brother was unable to speak of Troy or anything to do with the murder for years. His mother fell into deep depression and needed medication just to function. His sister was also silent and withdrawn. No one could believe what had happened to Troy, or that the killer had walked away free. Enter stage right, Major John Newsom of the Warren County Sheriff's Department. Newsom took charge of cold cases, and he was very, very good at what he did. He and his team solved several old cases, including a really difficult one from 1995 in which a police officer had killed his wife. As soon as that case was wrapped up, Newsom turned his sights on justice for Troy Temar. He started over, looking at files, photos, reading interviews, checking reports, double-checking stories, and watching videos. For 2.5 years, he studied the case. He checked Troy's background. Maybe Troy wasn't what he appeared to be. Was it an unknown score being settled? Did any coworkers of business associates have anything against him? Nope. Troy's life was as clean as it appeared to be. The only logical path the evidence took was one leading straight back to Teresa Voss, and so Newsom checked her story for that night. With a stopwatch, he drove to the 2 locations Voss said she'd been with Troy, then back to Troy's house and then to hers. The timeline didn't work. Her claim was impossible. Slowly, Newsom put together a picture of what happened on July 3rd, 1999. Troy had agreed to meet Teresa at a rather out-of-the-way location. Far from seeking to apologize and smooth things over, Voss fought with him and they argued. Voss got out of the car and went around to the driver's side, and Troy began to get out as well. She shot him before he could rise from his seat, aiming down into the car and striking him from above. Incapacitated and badly injured, Troy pleaded for help as he bled to death. It was these cries the 2 women passing by reported hearing the next day. Once he was dead, Voss dragged him from the car and covered him temporarily with brush. So how did she get 190-pound Troy Temar into the trunk of her car? She had help. Eric Hoerlen was Teresa Voss's brother. He had let her borrow his Glock 40 caliber pistol a few weeks earlier, showing her how to use it by shooting into a tree. She said she just wanted to use the gun to scare somebody. Newsom hauled Hoerlen in for questioning, and after some intense interrogation, he came clean. It was the major break police needed. Hoerlen said Teresa called him the night of the murder. She claimed Troy attacked her, and she'd been forced to shoot him in self-defense. He was dead, and she needed Hoerlen's help in getting his body into the trunk of the car so it could be disposed of. He said his sister was completely out of her mind and hysterical, and he only wanted to help her. Major Newsom was convinced that Hoerlen had not been the trigger man, and a deal was struck. His testimony in exchange for reduced charges of gross abuse of a corpse and tampering with evidence. He said he arrived at the crime scene and his sister provided him with rubber gloves and some slip-on shoes to deal with moving the body. After they had put Troy in the trunk, they drove to a random nearby car wash and threw the gloves, shoes, and her purse with the pistol in it into a dumpster. They drove to a spot near the abandoned farmhouse with Troy in the trunk and set it on fire. Teresa was placed under arrest September 13, 2005. Eric's confession and Newsom's timeline convicted her of murder. A detective spotted her driving by the murder scene the day after Troy was killed. Phone records showed she called Troy 80 times between June 7th and July 3rd. But then the calls suddenly stopped. No calls on July 4th or July 5th, although she insisted on July 6th that she didn't know he was killed. In reality, the reason she didn't call him was because she knew he was dead and that she was the one that had killed him. While in jail awaiting trial, she told the husband she married after Troy's murder that she in fact shot Troy and admitted, "I am not innocent." Given what I am about to tell you about Teresa's life before she met Troy Temar, she could hardly ever be called innocent. And hold on to your hat, because here's where shit gets crazy. Teresa, at 34, had 2 previous marriages, and she had tried to kill her second husband by stabbing him in the throat with a pair of scissors. She narrowly missed his carotid artery and was committed to a psychiatric hospital for treatment following the event. Immediately upon being released, she tried to hire someone to finish what she'd begun, to kill her husband, and then the 2 were divorced. After her divorce, Voss dated a man who remembered waking in the night to find a masked intruder attacking him with a hatchet. Luckily, he escaped, and the intruder admitted to police that Teresa had set it up, supplying him with the weapon and giving him the layout of the house before leaving the door unlocked. I wish I could tell you why Miss Voss was not put behind bars for any of this, but she wasn't, and the reasons are unclear. After her trial and conviction, Newsom asked Teresa in a letter to show some mercy to the Temar family and tell the whole story. She's never told anyone her full story or why she did what she did. Perhaps the most chilling note in this case is this. The night Troy was murdered, Teresa went to her parents' home in Montgomery, washed her face, and calmly painted her fingernails. She kills someone and comes home to paint her nails. That's a pure sociopath, Newsom said, one of the worst I've ever seen. Eric was sent to prison for 5 years. He said during his confession, Teresa knows exactly what she's doing every minute of every day. Like molten sugar, Troy Temar couldn't get Teresa Voss off him and out of his life before contact with her had done its terrible, irreversible damage. On October 27, 2006, Voss was found guilty and sentenced to 33 years to life for the aggravated murder of Troy Lee Temar. She won't have even a chance of freedom until 2039, when she is 75 years old. Troy Tamar's sudden and violent death at the hands of a mentally disturbed, dangerous woman left a hole in the small community of Deer Park, Ohio. Here, as in just about every case we describe to you, we find again the same words. Everyone knew everyone else. It was a quiet town. You didn't have to worry about locking your doors. Things like this just don't happen here. But sadly, things like this happen everywhere. At the Deer Park High School football field, Troy's presence is still keenly felt. This is where he played against other schools. This is the field where he was crowned homecoming king. In 2017, the press box overlooking this field that had meant so much to a well-loved young man was rededicated as the Troy Temar Memorial Press Box. Inside is a brass plaque with Troy's image. The effort was the culmination of the work of the Troy Temar Memorial Committee. The mission of the committee, it said, was we're putting our grief into positive action and we'll remember our friend forever. When the press box was dedicated, one of the referees for that night's game was John Newsom, who had brought Voss to justice. Yeah, terrible things happen in small towns too, but when they do, the people there can come together in a big way. It's unlikely that Troy Temar will ever be forgotten in Deer Park, Ohio. The Troy Temar Memorial Press Box is the tallest building in Deer Park, standing a solid 36 feet high. Thank you for listening to episode 18 of The State of Perfect Balance. You can follow us on Instagram at The State of Perfect Balance Pod and Twitter at State Perfect. Check out our website at thestateofperfectbalance.com. We bring you new episodes every other Sunday night with solved and unsolved murders in the smallest towns across Ohio. And remember, lock your doors. Evil lives everywhere. Not all small towns are safe. Troy's story continues after this quick word from our sponsors. Today's show is brought to you by Audible. Audible is offering our listeners a free audiobook with a 30-day trial membership. Just go to audibletrial.com/thestateofperfectbalance and browse the unmatched selection of audio programs. Download a title for free and start listening today. It's that easy. Go to audible.com/thestateofperfectbalance and get started today. And honestly, guys, I use Audible every single day of my life. No joke. Between actually reading and listening to books, I have read 50 books this year so far. 50. So come on, head on over to Audible. And if you want any kind of if you need any 50. So come on, what can you lose? Head on over to Audible today. Now back to our story. Kunk. Little Law and Order for you.